Good, thank you. Somebody did the whistle. That worked wonderfully. Good evening. Come on, one more. Good evening. Thank you, thank you. So we're in for a big treat tonight. For those of you who were here this morning, I'm still Alan Leshner, and for those of you who weren't, I am Alan Leshner. I'm the CEO Emeritus of AAAS, and I am a tremendous fan of tonight's speaker, so I'm not going to say anything insightful because I'm ready for him to talk. But it's a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce you to Atul Gawande. He's a renowned surgeon, writer, and public health researcher, public health guy. He practices actually medicine and general surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He's also the Sam Tier, who you may remember was the president of the Institute of Medicine, the Sam Tier Professor of Surgery at Harvard Medical School. He has a lot of jobs. He's the executive director of Ariadne Labs, chairman of Lifebox, a nonprofit organization making surgery safer globally. He was a Rhodes Scholar and a MacArthur Fellow. He's a fabulous guy, but the thing that has brought him to we in the science communication business's attention is his writing. And he, among other places, writes for The New Yorker. And it's interesting, in something I've been writing, I have been at risk of over-cribbing from a recent piece of his on trust in science. And then I found out that he's going to speak to us tonight about trust in science. I will try to behave. And so it's a wonderful pleasure for me to, at this symposium on the science of science communication, to present you one of the great science communicators, Atul Gawande.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for spending the time on these topics this week. I'm going to start out by saying that I've gotten to play three roles at the intersection of science and society, and all of them have ended up coloring my views of how to think about the mistrust of science. One of my roles is as a scientist, a generator of public health experiments and data in how to reduce death and improve quality of life through healthcare interventions. I work as a medical journalist at The New Yorker and in writing books. And then most directly, I'm a surgeon. And as a doctor, I'm also encountering these issues. In each role, I see the mistrust of science. My articles always have, I've learned not to read the comments section. So in my books and writing and my articles, especially the ones that directly touch on matters close to political and policy topics being debated, the charge of fake news is a constant. Then there's the charges that arise when we put out data with findings that might or might not be controversial, but ask people to make change in the way we practice, and many of the concerns are straightforward, genuine debate about the data, and then there are the allegations about whether they're factual or not at all. And then you see it every day, most directly in the role I play as a doctor, with patients really in doubt about whether the knowledge on which I base my plans as a surgeon, whether it is trustworthy or not trustworthy. And so how do we understand this? How do we even begin to wrap our minds around it. And I think it starts for me by trying to say, when we're talking about mistrust of science, what is science? And science is, I think, a commitment more than anything else to a systematic way of thinking. It's an allegiance to a way of building knowledge and explaining the universe through testing and factual observation. What's interesting about that particular set of commitments that people in science make is that they're making a commitment to what is not a normal way of thinking. Much of what we do in science may be counterintuitive. A scientific explanation will not necessarily be the same as the explanation that may come from the wisdom of divinity, or the explanations that come from experience, or the explanations that come from common sense. We watch the sun move across the sky. It's common sense, it's moving across the sky. Or that we see people get colds in cold weather, and cold must produce colds. The scientific mind is one where our intuitions are only hypotheses and they need testing. Now, I arrived in college, I majored in two sciences, biological sciences and political science. It was interesting being in both fields. And I was unnerved in both fields, learning about data, learning about theories, learning about explanations that made it clear how wrong many of my assumptions were about the natural or the man-made world. And then I looked to my professors and my fellow students to supply my replacement ideas. And then I took those ideas and then I went home on my first vacation back to Ohio and told my parents how wrong everything they taught me was, which they loved. And it took me a really long time to actually grasp the mindset of scientists. I love the way Edwin Hubble described that mindset. He said, scientists have a healthy skepticism, suspended judgment, and disciplined imagination. Healthy skepticism, suspended judgment, and disciplined imagination, which is a really weird way of being, if you think about it. You have skepticism, but to a healthy extent. You have judgment that you've suspended. You have imagination, but you have disciplined it. What exactly are we saying? I loved it, though, because what he's getting at is the idea that scientists have an experimental mind and not a litigious mind. And those are two different things. Contradictory evidence can always emerge. So that doesn't mean that you're free of opinion. You're arguing it out all the time. You have your hypotheses, you have your evidence, it's defending what you've come to, but contradictory evidence can always emerge. As Hubble said, the scientist explains the world by successive approximations. That scientific orientation has proved remarkably powerful over time. And yet scientists using that orientation are not trusted. Despite massive evidence, many people do not believe that childhood vaccines, many people believe that childhood vaccines cause autism. It does not. That people are safer if they own a gun. They are not. That climate change is not happening or related to man-made causes. And it is. The vaccine fears have persisted despite decades showing that they are unfounded. 25 years ago, a study showed a possible association between autism and thimerosal, a preservative in vaccines to prevent the vaccines from becoming contaminated by bacteria. Now, not long after that study was published, some fundamental flaws in the construction of that study were found, and subsequent studies, in fact now hundreds of studies, have not found any link between autism and thimerosal. And still the fear persisted. Those other studies were not trusted. And so we took thimerosal out of vaccines. Subsequently, there's been no reduction in the occurrence of autism. And then the fears only grew. Subsequently after that, a single UK study found in 8 of 12 autistic children that they had received the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine in a short period before their symptoms of autism appeared. Just before their symptoms of autism appeared, they got a vaccine. Vaccine followed by autism. That study was subsequently retracted. The lead author was found to have falsified and misrepresented the data. There's been efforts at replicating the findings, and they've been unsuccessful. But the vaccine rates plunged. We've had subsequently a return of measles and mumps outbreaks in 2015. It sickened tens of thousands of people in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe, and it has resulted in deaths. Now, the pattern is that we seem to resist scientific claims most when they clash with our intuitive beliefs, especially about what might be our own actions that we take. We don't see measles and mumps anymore. We do see autism. A parent who says, my child was fine until they were vaccinated, and then they became autistic. And there are a lot of those parents who can say that story. Now you can say to them, correlation is not causation. Children undergo vaccination every 2 to 3 months for the first 2 years of their life. So any onset of any illness will naturally follow, for many, many children, will naturally follow their vaccination. And that we have now legions of studies showing no connection. But once embedded, these beliefs are extremely hard to change, and especially when you don't trust scientific authorities. And trust in the scientific community is in steady decline. Part of the thinking about the idea that trust has been in decline is to pinpoint it to specific political events, like the most recent election, or the same charges rose during the Reagan administration, and whether the Reagan administration was particularly unscientific and fostering a set of beliefs that were more unscientific and eroding trust. And there's absolutely no connection, actually, between those political events and erosion in trust. The National Academy of Sciences has been sponsoring a set of surveys that have been out and have been deployed since at least the 1970s. And Gordon Goshat, an epidemiologist, had studied the data from 1974 to 2010. And the interesting thing about the findings are that there's just been this kind of steady, gradual drift downward in trust of the scientific community. The higher the education levels, the more significant, the more substantial the decline in trust in the scientific community. And that's especially true among conservatives, even the educated. And so what's been interesting has been that in all categories, liberal or conservative, educated with a college education or not, the trust in the scientific community has generally gone down, even while people have recognized the fruits of science. And that in 1974, an educated conservative had the highest level of trust in the scientific community, and they have now dropped to being the group with the lowest level of trust in the scientific community. But what I'd point out is that today we have factions who claim their own knowledge base that is often in conflict with what is provided by the scientific community. It may be a religious community with a different knowledge base around evolution. It may be industry with a different knowledge base around climate and climate skepticism. It may be It may be a left-leaning community who reject the medical establishment. And it doesn't make it wrong to question evolutionary theory or what the data are suggesting about climate or what the medical establishment has to say. God knows we have not always been right, right? But what's varied, so it's a varied set of constituencies, but what's alike is that they will hold to certain sacred beliefs that are not open to question from the evidence that the scientific community provides. Now what's interesting, what's different about our particular era of science mistrust from a century ago or many centuries ago is that we no longer dismiss scientific authority. As a society, the belief in the power and the fruits of science is strong. There is not a dismissal saying that divine authority is stronger and a better, more true indicator than a scientific authority. Instead, when people are dismissing science, it is not dismissing science or science authority, it is dismissing science authorities. They are not claiming that science is wrong, they are claiming the truer scientific authority, and that's what makes it particularly confusing. An industry group that will say, our data, our findings, our body of facts are the truer ones. We are more scientific. We have stronger science. And that's where I think the tasks of those who communicate about science becomes really crucial, because the discussion has changed. And what we now have to be able to do is to distinguish between, to understand how to recognize the difference between science and pseudoscience. There are 5 hallmark moves that people make when they are pushing pseudoscience rather than science. And they were outlined by a writer on the subject named Mark Hufnagel. The 5 hallmark moves are, number 1, to allege a conspiracy to suppress dissenting views. Number 2, to provide fake experts with contrary views but no credible scientific track record. Number 3 is to cherry pick data and papers to discredit a field. Number 4, to deploy false analogies and logical fallacies. And number 5, to set impossible research expectations. When science produces one level of uncertainty, then insist on another in a better safe than sorry argument. Any one of these kinds of charges, that there might be a conspiracy, that a expert without a scientific record might have something credible and important to say, that there might be a paper or a set of data that are completely contrary and do discredit a field, that certain analogies or different kinds of logic could end up being relevant, and finally, that we may need to lift the bar and set higher research expectations. But when you see the multiple tactics, when you see 3 or 4 or all 5 of these, that's when you know you're in the hands of pseudoscience rather than science. Pseudoscience, then, is the form of science without the substance. Now, how do you defend science as a more valid way to explain the world than the pseudoscience? And I guess the logical answer being here is to use science. People have done the experiments. There's a nifty book by a couple of Australian writers who have collected the science that's been done called the Debunking Handbook. And it's got sobering findings that were recently confirmed in a PNAS paper in a further study in this vein that show the same things. Lesson one is that when you rebut bad science, it backfires. Describing facts that disprove unscientific beliefs ends up strengthening the conviction of believers. It actually spreads familiarity with the belief and brings new converts. And that is partly because of the nature of the way the brain is. Misinformation sticks. If something seems like a common sense view, there's a mental model that we all have in our brain of how the world works. And debunking that mental model then leaves a gap. How then do I explain what is going on in the world? And that is a painful gap. And so supplying information that debunks that often strengthens it by providing defenses, by hoisting defenses up to make them true. And that's where lesson two comes in, which is that we're not actually doomed, though. Because the other set of data shows that while rebutting bad science may not be very effective, asserting true facts of good science is. Asserting how to understand what the contrary mental model is. And so it's critical that when you're asserting what the true facts are, to be able to explain what the explanatory narrative is. For example, it's important to debunk the vaccine myths, to do all those studies, but we don't want to focus with the public on what's wrong with the vaccine myths. Instead, we want to focus on the fact that giving children vaccines has proved over time vastly safer than not doing it. How do we know? Because there's a massive body of evidence that it's safe, including that we have tried the experiment before. 1989 to 1991, federal policy actively reduced access to funds for vaccination among the poor. Vaccinations fell to the point that the United States had an outbreak between 1989 to 1991 of 55,000 measles cases and 123 deaths. It's safe to give the vaccines, and it's deadly not to. That's the key thing that people have to understand. It's also important to be able to expose the bad science tactics that were used to mislead people, to help people see and recognize the pattern of bad science, just to even know that bad science has a pattern. And helping people recognize it arms them to have more scientific beliefs and to recognize it when they see it. An example would be in our current climate, we have an administration that uses the whole playbook, the whole pseudoscience playbook, for arguing with facts on everything from crime to the economy to climate to the original claim of whether President Obama was an American or not. So when we talk about an immigrant crime wave that has been non-existent, the charge is a conspiracy to suppress the real data of an immigrant crime wave and call it fake news. To cherry-pick cases. Here is a case where an immigrant caused a crime, and how can you argue in the face of that? To bring forward fake experts, people who have not had any scientific track record to make the case. And then to set ever higher expectations. Prove they're not a terrorist. Remember my daughter living as an exchange student with a family in France as a 16-year-old, and the bombings happened in France. And the family became afraid of her. And they wanted to know, is she a Muslim? And she wouldn't answer. And they took away the keys, because how do you prove you're not a terrorist? You're bogged down in trying to refute it. Now, the danger is that we reward this type of argument. We keep repeating the charge until the facts become contested, until someone who has the alternative set of facts sees it differently. You had 72% of conservatives doubt that Obama was an American until Trump admitted it himself. And then it rapidly snapped, rapidly flipped the other way. So having a scientific understanding of the world is really about helping people understand how you judge which information to trust, while understanding that the scientific mindset is one where you never have complete trust. That's a complicated thing, that at any time data could arise that contest what we understand. This phenol A, BPA, is a nice example of that. Carbon-based compound, widely used in polycarbonate plastics, epoxy resin lining of everything from lunch boxes to cans that food is supplied in. And there's been a confluence of studies that led people to being concerned that it is an endocrine disruptor. Streams that have studies of streams and their runoff found that there had been hormone effects on fish with a rise in the number that have extra or missing gonads. BPA was found at low levels. It's recognized to have aspects that can be like estrogen. Breast cancer is related to early estrogen exposure, and sperm counts can be related to early, low sperm counts can be related to early estrogen exposure. There's been 2 decades of research on whether BPA is associated with a change in endocrine and hormonal function, and a fierce division of argument on both sides of what that issue is. So how do you decide what to believe? You have a few strategies. Pour through the evidence yourself. As a knowledgeable citizen, you need to dig through it all. And we can't. Knowledge has become too vast and too complex to master. Few scientists can themselves give a full ground-up explanation of all the phenomena that they study. All right, so then if you can't rebuild the field from its base facts and all of us come to our individual judgment, then do you look to the pedigree of the scientists? Well, individual scientists can be incredibly pedigreed and famously bullheaded, enamored of pet theories, dismissive of new evidence, and heedless of their fallibility. I love the Max Planck observation, science advances one funeral at a time. All right, so now what do? Well, then do we turn to and rely on consensus? Well, that's been wrong. As one small example, one painful example in my own practice as a surgeon, I've been telling people for a good couple of decades who would say to me when I prescribe them opioids after surgery to cover their pain, they would say, oh, I don't want to take that, I might become addicted. And I would say, oh no, you don't have to worry about that. It is, a tiny fraction, under 1%, who would ever become addicted to these just for taking it for the short time for the period after surgery. Well, that turned out to be completely wrong. A naive person receiving opioids for elective surgery for 7 days has an 8% chance that 1 year later they will still be on that opioid. That is extraordinary. We caused that. The opioid epidemic that's killing more people than at the peak of the HIV epidemic in 1995 is is caused by us and our consensus, fed by Purdue Pharmaceuticals and others. But nonetheless, our consensus was one we did not dig deep enough and question, or at least I certainly didn't. And it's one finding that can certainly overturn it. We have many amazing examples of that. Plus, as we are learning about more and more, we have all the bad science. Most studies, most published studies, are wrong. And then, what about an issue like BPA, where there is no consensus? How do you arrive at anywhere to begin to think? Well, the key is, again, to go back to what does science look like versus what a pseudoscience looks like. It's how we do our work. Jeffrey Cabot, an epidemiologist at Einstein, dug deep on BPA, and he looked at it from a different direction. He looked at which views or which papers, which sides. You know, one of the challenges is that each side would tend to favor the data that supports their theory. So then he looked at it from the point of view of which side had the greater tendency to cherry pick the data. Which ones were more likely to narrow the focus to the papers that bolstered their point of view? Which ones grappled with the weakness of the BPA effect, that even at high doses it was difficult to extract an effect? Which papers were grappling with that? Which papers were searching for alternative explanations? For example, what's the concentration of oral contraceptives in streams that could also produce the hormone results? Which ones were citing the contrary data, for example, the dropping sperm counts that might go along with BPA work? Which one were assessing the totality of the views versus taking the litigious position? And you could never rule it out, but his conclusion that one direction was quite clear, that the groups that were doing the science and approaching it in that more scientific way consistently came out with finding that BPA was not a significant threat. That is an approach for being able to arrive at a way of finding your way through the maze. You look at what is the scientific approach. The key then is our knowledge and our virtues of our scientific orientation lives more in the community and in the body of the work than in any individual. It's critical to understand that science and advanced science is a social enterprise with an intricate division of cognitive labor. As a community endeavor, it's been beautifully, amazingly self-correcting over time. It is not beautifully organized, however. Up close, it can be an extremely rickety-looking vehicle for arriving at truth. We have the muddled peer review process. We have all the badly written journal articles. We have the subtly contemptuous letters to the editor. The overtly contemptuous Reddit threads. We have the pompous pronouncements of the Academy. And it will not get any prettier. There's a contradictory idea for us to embrace. An elitism in our method, but a democratization of data. The elitism of the method is recognizing what science actually looks like. The democratization is the fact that more and more in healthcare, for example, in medicine, for example, the analysis of data was a kind of something that was available to only a very narrow set of individuals who are in the medical world. It was something that belonged to a kind of distinct profession. People had the access to the computing power and knew how to run it and knew how to manage it. Now, we have data at our fingertips, work with it regularly, and virtually anybody throughout our organizations and beyond, patients and others, can analyze that data and should. We have a vast proliferation of journals that has meant that the bar has lowered for being able to arrive at publication. And it's my view that that is a good thing, but it also means that it's a much messier thing, that the standards are going to be far more variable. And so the elitist aspect is to be able to rate and see what is the level of science that was performed. We need more of the negative studies that aren't getting out there. We need more of the analyses of data. We may need more analyses of the same data done by different people. And understanding how to recognize when they have those attributes that Jeffrey Cobbett analyzed as a way of beginning to see how much does this actually look like what science looks like. Have they grappled with the contrary evidence? One of the striking things to me is being in all of these different worlds is that I've been subject to the peer review process, and I've been subject to the New Yorker fact-checking process. And the New Yorker fact-checking process kicks the peer review process's ass every day. The New Yorker, so if I get an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, I have to make sure I've sourced and put my references in for every fact that I cite. At the New Yorker, I have to send my sources and my citations for every fact I cite in the New Yorker piece. And then a fact checker looks up my citations to see if I'm cherry picking from those citations. And then takes a further step and looks up contrary citations to see whether I have been skipping citations that I'm not citing. They even fact check the jokes. They saved me one time. I actually cited a joke that Bill Cosby told about how men can understand what delivering a baby is like. And they fact-checked it and found that Carol Burnett told the original joke. And they did it by calling Carol Burnett's agent. They had a hint that this might not be his joke, but might be hers. Called the agent, and he said, I don't know if that's hers. Why don't I put her on the line? And she picked up the phone, and she said, I've been saying for 10 years that he was telling that joke completely wrong. And now you probably want to know what the joke was. So the joke, so for all the guys in the room, if you want to know what it's like to deliver a baby, what you have to do, she explained, the proper way for me to tell this joke is that you have to take your bottom lip and pull it out. Take your lip, just pull it out, guys. There you go. All right, now pull it over your head. The New Yorker fact-checking process has saved me more times and protected me from, my pieces have not been totally free of errors by any means. But that rigor and that looking for, am I thinking like someone who just wants to come to a point of view, or am I recognizing all the contrary views and how do I deal with it? They don't come to the judgment. What they end up coming to me with is saying, how do you grapple with this? And you have to offer a way to grapple with it in order for it to come to publication. So as I said, it won't get prettier as we democratize our ability to argue over facts, argue over observations. But the fact that more and more people can do it is good. There's that puzzle. Why would it be the case that the more educated people are, the more that we become people who are more likely to doubt science? Well, I think the way to think about it is recognizing that on the one hand, the scientific community is arguably the most powerful collective enterprise in human history. And that adding to that community is going to be more and more powerful and get us to places even faster. On the other hand, as people come to encounter this work, people are often deeply skeptical of even the most basic knowledge. In my work, and I'm as a surgeon, there is fundamental skepticism on a regular basis of the most basic knowledge from quote-unquote mainstream science. By the way, it's a peeve of mine that people call it mainstream science versus any other kind of science. There is no other kind of science, it's just science. So in my discussions with my patients, there are fundamental facts about physiology, nutrition, diseases, medicines, you name it. And the doubting is usually among the most educated. The education may expose people to science, but it also has a countervailing effect too, which it makes us more individualistic and more ideological. So then when I have to figure out how do I cope with that with the patient, the mistake is believing that my scientific credentials give me any special authority on truth with them. What a scientific education offers, I think, is something that's more important, which is understanding what real truth-seeking looks like. And so my clinic visits have to be a dialogue and a joint reflection of that truth-seeking. The effort of people, the more the better, discussing and pursuing ideas with curiosity, inquisitiveness, openness, and discipline is the way I have to get through my clinic, and as the way that we, in equivalent ways, have to do it with the public. We are sitting side by side. I'm explaining how I've grappled with the science, how I've dealt with the contrary views, and why this is the place I come to and ask them how they take their read on it. And sometimes they completely disagree. Sometimes I'm petrified about it. I've had cancer patients who have eminently, totally curable cancer. But I cannot force them in the door to trust that going under the knife is going to be the way to go without walking through, well, here's what our 40 years of data suggest. And sometimes they still don't buy it. And so what we then say is, then let's observe together. I'm not going to fire you from the practice. We're going to experiment. Maybe you are different. And we're going to come back and do another scan in a month. And then maybe a month after that. We've watched cancers grow together. I've never gone all the way to watching it metastasize and kill somebody together. Eventually, as we watch our way through that and grapple with the evidence, we have made that change. Ironically, it was with a fellow Harvard Medical School graduate with me in my class, who himself as a physician did not believe the data that his own colon cancer should be cured, required surgery to be cured. Instead, tried alternative therapies and watched a stage 1 cancer go all the way to stage 4 and then died. One of the few cases I've seen where that has happened. The key effort is discussing and pursuing these ideas with, as I said, the curiosity, inquisitiveness, openness, and discipline, which is to say, as scientists. In the end, then, it's even more than what we think. It's how we think that matters. The stakes for understanding this could not be any higher than they are today, because we're not just battling anymore what it means to be scientists. We're battling for what it means to be citizens. Thank you.
Please. So that was fabulous. Lived up to my expectations. Therefore, you may live. I'm going to join you over here, and I'll moderate. Are you green? If you look, there's a...
Sure. Yes.
Good. And we can hear you. Let me just let you know that there's people, thousands, who are watching on the web, and they've been tweeting, and I have on this little iPad tweets.
Okay.
At the same time, people will ask for the flashing microphone, which are those lights, and we'll send them to one place or another. And I just want to start by commenting. I couldn't help thinking as you were speaking that it really is unfortunate that scientists are also people and that they fall prey to many of the things we accuse other people of falling prey to. I thought your approach of engaging with the public is, by the way, consistent with our discussion today, and that's important. I took a lot of notes, and I'm not going to go through them and make the mistake of trying to summarize. So what I'm going to do is read a few of these tweets or questions that have been posed, and then we'll let them have at you. Okay? Good. All right. So please share your thoughts about the challenge of explaining uncertainty as a necessary component of scientific understanding. The fact that scientists can never claim something as being absolutely true. And you, in fact, did talk a bit about that. But.
Right. Yes, the sense, I love that phrase that scientists are always, and I forgot the phrase, an approximation of certainty. What did I do with my notes?
I ate them.
Hubble's quote, yes. The scientist explains the world by successive approximations. Being able to explain uncertainty requires capturing that idea of successive approximation, because uncertainty implies that, well, we don't know any better now than we knew before, and that, when an idea is upended, that we never knew anything in the first place. And being able to, and so I use that quote not infrequently when I'm explaining with my patients when ideas are upended, that we're always in a search for getting closer to the truth of what goes on, and that has allowed us to be in a place where we went from a world where the average person only lived into your mid-40s to one where today, with having a regular source of health care over the course of your life, that you can live on average into your 80s. And people understand that when you take them up to the telescopic view for a minute and say, this has what's worked over time, but it's not been a linear path, and that there are still uncertainties along the way, and let's see how we're going to grapple with this uncertainty around this decision we have to make, then we're able to move forward. It's a different thing when you're, the one kind of terrible thing as a patient is you are having to make a choice about yourself and make a step or a pathway forward, and it becomes a decision about who do you trust and what's your own read on your own uncertainty and how you deal with it. When we are talking about asking people to make changes in policy at a national level, it's a similar kind of thing, but it has a less immediate force. The most difficult topics are the ones where we're asking people to engage in pain now for the sake of a invisible problem where the pain will only have gain far in the future. I'll give you an example, explain what I mean. Two key discoveries changed surgery in the 19th century. One was antisepsis, and the other was anesthesia. Anesthesia spread within weeks after publication all around the world. Within 6 years, there was not a hospital in the country that was not doing anesthesia for surgery. Joseph Lister showed that antisepsis, the use of antiseptic solutions, was to sterilize instruments and equipment and everything else, could virtually eliminate the biggest killer of people from surgical care, which is infection. And he could not sell it. He could not get people to follow it. Patients didn't demand it. So why? Why would one spread like wildfire and the other not? And the reason why is anesthesia had an immediate and visible effect, and the other one was attacking an invisible problem, germs. An infection takes a week to appear. And then the second problem was, okay, so one had an immediate and visible effect, the other had an invisible and delayed effect. Second problem was that both were good for the patient, only one was good for the doctor. Surgeons didn't like operating on screaming patients.
Moody of them.
Yeah. You had to have 2 or 3 orderlies pinning them down. The operations would take usually 60 to 120 seconds. That was as long as you could get, you know. And then under anesthesia, you had time, you could be meticulous, you could get better results. Everybody wanted it. By contrast, antiseptic solution was literally painful. The antiseptic solution Lister had was carbolic acid, a dilute form of carbolic acid. He would try to sell you the same way we still try to sell Listerine today. The burn tells you that it's working. And the invisibleness and the uncertainty about, is this really the germ theory? And it took, 15 years, 20 years to convince people that germs were even what's going on. And then you were trying to make an invisible cause, go through invisible pain now for a delayed gain. And that's climate change. It's the ultimate invisible effect with pain now. Every solution we come up with involves pain now for gain later. And so you're asking people to make choices that they don't necessarily want to make. And then in dealing with the uncertainty, we have lots of biases about wanting to move that way. And just continually trying to grapple with it, people are shifting in their understanding and belief. Even this administration released last week a report documenting all of the evidence about man-made climate change.
Good. Let's go to the audience. Way up there, the microphone is waving. Please speak loudly into it.
Atul, thank you for your remarks. My name is Mona Bell. I work with NOAA's Sea Grant program. I'm a geoscientist. I actually wanted to follow up with another question on uncertainty. So doctors make informed decisions based on incomplete information, and patients eventually build that trust with the doctor, and they depend on their lives. I'm a geoscientist, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts on whether there's a difference between uncertainty in medicine versus uncertainty in geoscience, and if there's anything that we as geoscientists can learn from doctors.
Well, I do think there is something to learn from all of our experiences in grappling with data, right? So what has always been, what attracted me to surgery in the end, I had no plan to go into surgery, except I sort of fell in love in the operating room when I was on my rotations as a medical student, and partly it was falling in love with the blood and the guts and all that stuff, and getting to do things, with your hands. But mostly what I was really attracted to was the situation. You have a problem that has arisen of which you only have limited information about what is going on inside a person. You have an uncertain science behind that information. The science is always imperfect. Your skills are always limited. Your knowledge is always fallible. and yet there is benefit from acting rather than not acting. In fact, you can cause more harm in many situations by failing to act rather than from failing to act and and being paralyzed by the circumstances rather than grappling with it and moving ahead. And then what I loved about it was that the best surgeons I knew then owned and took accountability for the mistakes that then came, and then used that to keep learning and moving on. It was in miniature the kind of sequential scientific ethos. In geoscience and anything we do, if we're doing work that matters, it has consequences. Grappling with your fallibility, your limitations, is what we all end up doing in the face of data. And that set of consequences can be quite delayed, or it can be more immediate. Surgery, it's more readily obvious. I see the results, usually within hours, if not within hours, within days of my actions, and learn whether a mistake has been made or a mistake has not been made. It's much more difficult in geoscience to understand whether those mistakes have been made, but you can't progress unless you're able to falsify it in some way. In a way, you're kind of like the primary care doctors of the world, right? The primary care doctors are arguably save more lives than I do. The biggest killer in the country is, now with smoking declined, it's hypertension, it's high blood pressure. There's no country in the world that has more than 50% of their people who have high blood pressure under adequate control. It's another classic case like climate change, an invisible problem that nobody feels, that requires you to take medications that might have side effects that don't always feel good, but have remarkable effects on lowering your likelihood of dying from cardiovascular disease. In the United States, we're only at 40% of our severe hypertensives having it under adequate control, and 1/3 of adults have this problem. So health system out in California, Kaiser Permanente, took it on this problem and got people up to over 80% adherence by being systematic about it and learning how to take it on. And then found over time, and it took years, that they created the first population where cardiovascular disease was no longer the #1 killer. And then Minnesota did it. Minnesota took it on as a state and brought it at a community health level and got up to over 70% and became the first state that I'm aware of that cardiovascular disease became the #2 killer, went down from #1. And so, that ability to act in front of disease and to be able to address it even when it takes years to see the effect of high blood pressure on dementia rates, on stroke rates, on heart attack rates. And in geoscience, you're acting in geological time. So it's even more that sense of being able to act ahead of what the data shows. Makes it very hard to iterate.
Or replicate.
But the consequences are high because you're asking us on this data to make choices about how we live and work now. And so I think it is not dissimilar, it's just harder because you don't get to iterate quite as much and you have to create ways that it's possible to learn and falsify along the way.
Great. I think there's one up there.
It's over there. Oh, sorry.
Whoops.
Yes.
I'll come there next.
Okay.
Good evening. I have some good news on the climate front. We are essentially at the anesthesia point with the dramatic drops that we've seen in the last few years in the costs, particularly of renewable energy such as solar and wind. And we are essentially at the similar tipping point with respect to energy storage, which is one of the reasons why already we've seen that the majority of new power installations around the globe over the last couple of years have in fact been non-fossil.
Well, I'll just say that one of the interesting things is because it's becoming easier to do something about it. I mean, many of us have neighbors who have installed solar arrays and found it's very functional. I'm from rural Ohio. Athens County is the poorest county in Ohio. And, my mother installed a solar array and it is now a whole business across our county, the more it becomes easier to do something about it and see beneficial results. You're making an interesting point, which is that may also be feeding into our ability, our recognition of it being a phenomenon that has to be solved. And so, you know, the levels of belief had been declining, and they're starting to move in the other direction.
Let's go over here.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Sneha Ramakrishna. I'm a pediatric oncologist. And I think you did a really good job of talking about how the environment in which we deliver information in medicine has changed, or in science in general, just in terms of the availability of data to the general public. My question is, in the setting of the change of how the public experiences data, how should we educate future scientists and medical professionals to sort of become communicators of that education within this environment?
That's a good question. I think I always want to come back to science again, which is that understanding ways that we are communicating better and how to educate people to communicate better, I think requires us to almost treat it as an experiment by itself. A lot of the work that I've been involved in lately has been thinking about how we educate clinicians to talk to patients about their goals as they face the end of life, another topic people don't really want to grapple with. And finding that it has been possible to educate people in the clinical profession and do it as a study. We just completed a study at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute where we tested approaches to teach the clinicians to make it effective. Part of it was to make it simple for the clinician to communicate well. That required having the clinicians practice in a role play for just a couple of hours in being able to move from thinking of themselves as a fact giver. Here is the condition, here's your situation with your cancer, here are the treatments, the pros, the cons, the risks, the benefits of each of them. Now what do you want? And then patients would say, well, what would you do, doctor? And then you say, no, no, no. There's no wrong answers. You just need to decide what you want to do, and then people feel lost. And then we ask the clinicians to try testing out being a counselor, which means eliciting people's goals. And we walk them through a way of doing that. Try using these 7 questions. What's your understanding of where you are with your illness at this time? What would you like to know about what might be ahead for you from me? In other words, what would you like to know about your prognosis from me? What are your fears for your future with your health? What are your goals if your health worsens? What are you willing to go through? What are you not willing to go through for the sake of more time? What's the minimum quality of life you'd find acceptable? And then and we found that asking those questions made it less frightening for both patient and clinician to talk about the uncertainty of what's ahead and the plan that you would want for what might come, because what comes out of it is a set of goals, and now you can make a recommendation. Oh, the minimum quality of life, as I said, wrote about in my most recent book, Be Immortal. One person said to me, described, their answer to the question, what's the minimum quality of life I'd find acceptable? Well, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on television, that'd be good enough for me. It's like the best living will ever. And that then became a guide point to be able to describe it along the way. Now, we've done better in that field of palliative care, geriatrics, testing. How do you teach clinicians, students, and others to communicate bad news, set goals, and do all those things? I'm unaware of. There may well be studies, but we certainly haven't scaled it up in the way, we're moving this kind of training through large populations now with multiple different groups putting these kind of training systems in at state and national levels. We haven't done that when it comes to educating clinicians and others, journalists and others, in how you are able to communicate well with other people and systematically trained it. I suspect it's much along the same ways. being able to learn how to walk your way through having people recognize for themselves these 5 elements of recognizing pseudoscience versus science, the ways that people are arguing from conspiracy or logical fallacies and so on.
Go ahead.
Ben Schneiderman, University of Maryland. Thank you for your lucid description about the mistrust of science. In fact, others like Sean Otto have written about the war on science and the death of expertise. And there seems to be a joyous sense on some researchers to point out the failings of expert witnesses or the mistakes of doctors. And on top of this, we have the current misleading excesses of artificial intelligence that suggests we'll all soon be replaced by more perfect machines. What do you see as the prospect for an effort to celebrate the creative potentials of humans, make distinctions, and clarify what it is that experts are so expert at, and promote a heroic attitude about those who are truly experts, such as yourself?
Well, a couple of things. One is first is about the negative outliers, the terrible expert witnesses and all of those. The part of the interesting, we will never get rid of the negative outliers, right? And in fact, as expertise proliferates, as access to data grows, it just means the bell curve will be larger and it will continue to be wide. And part of what's interesting is understanding, I've always been focused on and more interested in what's happening among the positive deviants, the positive outliers, than the negative outliers. What are they doing that allows you to grasp how they're able to either communicate better or arrive at better results? And we're often much less interested in the positive outliers than the negative outliers. I think some of that is just human nature. We are motivated and driven much more by threat than by promise. We are driven much more by the fears of the risks and the outrageous than we are by the heroic and the competent. Competence is just not that sexy, and so being able to there's a whole field of solutions journalism, which is about the idea of being interested in the positive deviance and showing people why those things matter. And I think what I've learned, I think one of the people who do it better than most is Malcolm Gladwell, my colleague at The New Yorker, where being able to celebrate those who have made insights and help explain how they actually matter in people's lives. And it's been that last part that's crucial. Being able to explain, most of my stories in a similar way tend to take you into the puzzle that we're grappling with. The threat or the difficulty that we are up against answering a crucial question that we need to go ahead with, that we need to solve. And then understanding the person who then unlocks the solution helps you understand the scientific method, helps you understand how people are grappling with all the contradictory evidence, and then helps you see what they have found, and you've learned 2 things along the way. One is what has turned out to really matter. When I was writing about end-of-life care for the first time, I was really trying to figure out how to write about it in the face of the charge of death panels. And the death panel charge was focused on a really a very very intuitive and easy to remember and easy to imagine concern, which is that these conversations about what you might want at the end of life are really about losing control, wanting you to give up and let us unplug you from the supports that would keep you going, because someone wants to make more money. And that death panel charge, that this is going to be government that's going to take control of your care, is undermined our ability to actually do something about the fact that mostly at the end of life, people are taking therapies that are giving them more toxicity, more complications, and reduces their length of life as well as their quality of life. And so being able to work in the opposite direction, I took a lesson from these other directions to say, what do we actually want at that moment when something has gone wrong, we tried to treat, and now it's not getting better? And then meet some people who do a better job handling that situation than I knew how to do. And what happens if I take that, what they do, and observe what happens and what's different about that? What I described earlier was a different pathway, and I didn't even have to tell you that it was going up against the whole death panel idea. But it made it clear the heroes that are the people who work in palliative care and geriatrics have a set of skills that all of us can have, that families can have in talking to their to one another, that clinicians need to have in talking to one another. And so now we've described the heroes, a different way of thinking about it, and guess what? I'm not the only one who's been doing this. There's been a variety of people who've been moving in this direction, and we have left behind, you never know for good, but we have left behind the idea that these discussions are death panels, and that even paying clinicians and expecting clinicians to do this is a death panel. That is, so we don't always want to grab onto a hero, but people with solutions and directions for solutions for major issues in our lives, major threats to our world, that is still something people can attach themselves to and believe in.
I think, given the time, the death of death panels is a good time to stop. Let me, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for a very illuminating evening. This has been great. Thank you.